Now, today marks the International Day in support of victims of torture. The day offers support to the thousands of victims of torture, both in the past and in the present. South Africa is a signatory to international torture conventions, but the UN Committee Against Torture has raised concerns about South Africa's anti-torture law and its failure to stipulate minimum sentences for acts of torture. How seriously does South Africa treat crimes of torture when we are still confronted by reports of torture in prisons? To unpack the story for us, we're joined now by Deputy Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, John Jeffery, who will participate in a webinar on the subject. John, thanks very much for your time this morning on the AM report. Tell us about the International Day of Torture, why it's important in South Africa that we take a moment and reflect on how we are faring on the subject.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, and good morning to the viewers, and thanks for having me. It's International Day for the victims of torture. It's the day, I think, when the UN declaration was signed. So I think that's why they picked today for South Africa. It's also the day of Freedom Charter Day, as it were. But basically, torture is basically something that states or state agents do, and there are two. There's a main convention against torture, which we ratified some time ago. We passed a law against torture in 2013. And then more recently, last year, we ratified the optional protocol for the Convention Against Torture, which is setting up a national preventative mechanism, an independent body to invest or to visit places of detention. That's places where people are held against their will because of a court order. So this mechanism was established and is starting to become operational. The mechanism is being coordinated and run by the South African Human Rights Commission.
So is this what we talk about when we ask the question around oversight bodies in South Africa when it comes to incidents of torture in our country, be it at detention centres, at prisons, be it criminals, suspected criminals, or refugees? Do we have that kind of oversight body?
Yeah, look, some of those bodies exist already. So for correctional facilities, you've got a judicial inspectorate, a judge who heads that inspectorate. It's currently retired Constitutional Court Judge Edwin Cameron. For the police, you've got the Independent Police Investigating Directorate. You've got also then the military ombud. But what has happened with the ratification of the optional protocol is that a coordinating structure has been set up, led by the South African Human Rights Commission. So they are actually the body, the central body. Places like Lindela, they conduct visits. That's the facility for illegal immigrants who are being returned to their countries of origin. So they get visited by the Human Rights Commission. So their job at the moment is to coordinate what is already there and to strengthen the bodies that are already there.
John, I want to just take a step back and take us back to that decision in 2016 when South Africa decided to withdraw from the Rome Statute of the ICC. What is the status of international criminal jurisdiction given those kinds of decisions by countries?
Well, we took a decision. It hasn't been implemented as yet. A international crimes bill was introduced to Parliament, but it hasn't been processed as yet. So we're still members of the International Criminal Court. And that defines, well, that's more about the court having jurisdiction to be able to try people. In our own country, the Torture Act gives us the power to prosecute any crime of torture wherever it happened in the world. So it doesn't really, whether we're members of the International Criminal Court or not, doesn't really affect our ability to deal with crimes of torture. And we are continuously extraditing people to other countries when requested. So I think that things are in order in that regard.
Okay. Yeah. So you were talking about the South African Human Rights Commission, and it really has a broad mandate, doesn't it? And there's always questions around whether it has the financial resources that enables it to fulfill that very broad mandate.
Yeah, look, there's ring-fenced money, as far as I understand, that they have for the establishment of the National Preventative Mechanism. Obviously, the more resources you have, the better role you can play in monitoring. So, but everybody knows we are under financial pressure as South Africa at this stage. But they do have ring-fenced funds, although obviously they could do with more.
So, John, before we let you go, you're taking part in a webinar on the issue around International Day in Support of Victims of Torture. Who will be a part of that webinar? Take us through some of the things that you're hoping to hear, hoping to discuss.
Look, the general problem with South Africa, I think, is that we've got good laws. The problem is their implementation. And I think the same applies for the treatment of people in custody. The monitoring that the independent mechanism is meant to do is of correctional facilities, detention barracks, hospitals where people have been sent as state patients, so not normal psychiatric wards, but where they are state patients. It would be youth detention centers, amongst others. The idea of the preventative mechanism is specifically preventative. So the idea is that with these visits, it will make it more difficult for people running these facilities to engage in acts of torture, or acts that would be described as acts of torture against the people in there. So that is basically the challenge. The aim of the webinar, I mean, we're just starting this process with the National Preventative Mechanism. It is established, but it's got to get up and running. It's got to function. We've got to look at the issue of what can they do with the available resources. So those are some of the things that I hope would be covered. And then, sorry, the other point is how do we strengthen the existing structures that exist? They need to be independent. Are they independent enough? Those are some of the issues that I hope will be covered in the webinar.
Yeah, all big issues. It's a good thing from what you're telling us that a spotlight is being shone on this International Day of Support for Victims of Torture. Thanks very much for unpacking it for us. John Jeffery joining us there via our video line. He is Deputy Minister of Justice and Correctional Services.